The conference room fell silent as Trump leaned into his microphone, that familiar smirk playing across his face, radiating a practiced, theatrical confidence. He addressed the Congresswoman with a voice dripping with condescension, utilizing a diminutive endearment to belittle her stature. He speculated aloud about her age, guessing she was perhaps 40 or 42, implying that such youth rendered her incapable of grasping the intricate mechanics of federal programs. Social Security and Medicare, he asserted, were complex systems beyond the comprehension of the inexperienced. He suggested, with a dismissive wave of his hand, that she should take her seat and allow the adults, specifically those who had actually built businesses, to discuss the serious matter of fiscal responsibility. A few supporters in the crowd chuckled at the slight, enjoying the show of dominance. Some seniors in the front rows nodded in agreement, captivated by the aura of authority he projected. Trump sat back, arms crossed over his chest, utterly satisfied with his dismissal. Jasmine Crockett did not blink. She did not raise her voice, nor did she show the slightest flicker of the irritation he had hoped to provoke. Instead, she simply opened the heavy binder in front of her with deliberate slowness. The sound of pages turning was sharp, cutting through the silence of the room like a paper knife. She addressed him then, her voice level and cold, informing him in the room that she was 43 years old, a civil rights attorney, and a duly elected member of the United States Congress. She stated flatly that she had read every single one of his budget proposals spanning the years from 2017 to 2021. She looked up, locking her eyes onto his, and posed the silent, heavy question of whether he had done the same. Trump's smirk faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching as the atmosphere shifted. He attempted to interject, to claim knowledge of his own administration's work, but she pressed on relentlessly. She lifted a document, holding it aloft so the bank of news cameras could capture the text, and cited the specific location, page 64 of his 2020 budget. She detailed the proposal therein, which outlined a staggering cut of $84 billion to Social Security disability insurance over 10 years. She placed the document down and lifted another with rhythmic precision. She cited the 2019 budget, page 112, revealing a proposed $845 billion reduction to Medicare over a decade. Another document rose into the air. She cited the 2018 budget, highlighting $72 billion in cuts to Social Security. She stacked them on the table one after another, each landing with a soft, heavy thud that echoed in the silent room, a physical manifestation of the policies he denied. She asked if she should continue, noting that she possessed 4 more years' worth of documentation. Trump shifted in his seat, his comfort visibly eroding. He muttered about proposals, dismissing the figures as mere Washington budget talk, insisting that she did not understand the nuance of negotiation. She countered immediately, opening her binder to a marked page, asserting that she understood perfectly. She reminded him of what he had told seniors in 2016, recalling his exact promise to protect and save their Social Security and Medicare, a deal he claimed to have made long ago. She looked up at the audience, scanning the rows of seniors, many wearing red hats, many who had voted for him twice based on that very assurance. But then she pivoted to what he had not told them. She projected an image on the screen behind her, a digital archive of his own words from March 2020. Where he had signaled an intention to cut entitlements after the election. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the stark contradiction was displayed in high definition. Trump lunged forward, protesting that the statement was out of context, claiming his target had been waste and fraud. Crockett remained unnervingly calm, dismantling this defense by citing his own personnel choices. She reminded the room that his own budget director, Mick Mulvaney, had referred to Social Security as a Ponzi scheme. She listed his appointments, Russell Vought, Rick Perry, noting their shared ideological desire to privatize the safety net. She brought up Project 2025, written by his advisors, which proposed raising the retirement age to 69 and cutting benefits for anyone earning over $40,000 a year. She paused, letting the weight of the numbers sink into the consciousness of the room. She addressed the insult he had levied at the start, returning to his use of the word sweetie and his claim that she did not understand. She leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave, becoming harder and more resonant. She declared that she understood these programs perfectly. She understood that he had promised to protect them while simultaneously attempting to gut them. She understood that he had gifted $1.9 trillion in tax cuts to billionaires, 83% of which went to the top 1%, and then subsequently claimed the country could not afford Social Security. Her voice grew lower, vibrating with controlled anger, as she confessed that the only thing she did not understand was why he believed these people were unintelligent enough to keep believing him. The room erupted. Shouts burst from both sides of the aisle. Trump's face reddened, veins becoming visible at his temples as his composure cracked completely. He stammered, attempting to regain control, but Crockett did not yield. She did not raise her voice to match the chaos, instead. Her tone cut through the noise with the precision of a scalpel. She reminded him that he had questioned her intelligence and insulted her in front of the electorate. And therefore, they were going to have the conversation he had been desperate to avoid. She turned her attention entirely to the audience. Bypassing the moderator and the former president, she asked for a show of hands from those who depended on Social Security for at least half their income. Slowly, hands went up, tentatively at first, then in a wave that consumed more than half the room. She asked how many would struggle to afford healthcare without Medicare. More hands rose, including those of some staunch supporters wearing his merchandise. She told them that they deserved to know the truth about what this man had planned for their futures. She looked back at Trump, her expression unyielding, and announced that unlike him, she had brought receipts. She gestured to her aide, who wheeled in a heavy cart stacked with binders, a visual library of bureaucratic intent. There were 4 years of budget proposals, 12 years of his public statements on entitlements, and documentation from every advisor he had ever appointed on the issue. She paused for effect, letting the sheer volume of evidence stand as a testament to her preparation. Then she announced the presence of 4 real people from red districts, Trump districts, who were waiting to tell the audience exactly how his policies had impacted their lives. Trump stood abruptly, jabbing his finger toward her, accusing her of orchestrating an ambush and a setup. Crockett remained seated, utterly composed. Correcting him, she stated that this was not an ambush, but accountability, a phenomenon he had apparently never experienced. She opened the first binder, inviting him to begin with 2017, his first budget. She offered him the choice. He could tell these seniors what he had proposed, or she would do it for him. The moderator, a local news anchor who had been struggling to maintain control of the escalating tension, cleared his throat nervously and suggested they might move on. Trump cut him off, his voice sharp and defensive. He demanded that she be allowed to talk, convinced that if she were given enough rope, she would expose herself as a fraud. He challenged the Congresswoman to proceed with her presentation, his confidence returning as he convinced himself he was calling her bluff. Crockett smiled, though the expression did not reach her eyes. She thanked him and stood up. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a spreadsheet that was color-coded and meticulously organized. She began with his 2017 budget, his first year in office. She narrated the disconnect between his promises to seniors and the reality of page 45, which proposed converting Medicare to a premium support system, essentially a voucher program. She cited the Congressional Budget Office estimate that this change would have increased out-of-pocket costs for seniors by an average of $6,400 per year. The screen changed, replacing the spreadsheet with a video clip. It was Trump at a rally in Florida in 2016, his voice booming over the speakers, claiming that his opponent wanted to cut Social Security and Medicare, while he vowed to save it and ensure nobody touched it. The crowd in the room watched in silence as the crowd in the video cheered. Crockett let the clip play to its conclusion before stopping it. She juxtaposed the promise with the budget, splitting the screen. On one side was the campaign rhetoric, on the other was a highlighted section of his 2017 budget outlining Medicare reforms designed to reduce spending by $554 billion over 10 years. She emphasized the number, stating clearly that $554 billion was not waste and fraud, it was benefits. Trump's jaw clenched, his face tightening. He argued that they were modernizing the system, making it more efficient, implying that seniors needed to contribute more to save the structure. Crockett did not let him finish the thought. She pointed out that his budget specifically proposed increasing Medicare premiums for middle-income seniors. She illustrated the impact. Someone making $85,000 a year, perhaps a teacher with a decent pension, would see their Medicare Part B premiums increase by 35%. She clicked to the next slide, moving to his 2018 budget, describing it as even more aggressive. She revealed his proposal to raise the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to 67. She asked if he knew what that meant for someone retiring at 65. And without waiting for an answer, she explained the reality: 2 years of paying for private insurance. She calculated the average cost for a 65-year-old at about $1,200 per month, totaling nearly $29,000 they would have to pay out of pocket, money they did not have, while waiting to access a program they had paid into their entire lives. A woman in the audience, appearing to be around 70, raised her hand. With a nod from the moderator, she stood, her voice shaking slightly as she shared that she had retired at 65 and could never have afforded 2 more years of private insurance. She would have been forced to keep working until her body gave out. Crockett nodded to her, affirming that this was exactly the point. These were not merely numbers on a page. They were the metrics of survival for real lives. Trump leaned forward, insisting that tough choices were necessary because the programs were going bankrupt. Crockett's voice cut like a blade as she corrected him. She stated that everyone knew they were not going bankrupt. She cited the Social Security Trust Fund's $2.7 trillion reserve, capable of paying full benefits until 2034. She outlined the simple fix: removing the payroll tax cap. She explained that currently, someone making $160,000 paid the same amount into Social Security as someone making $160 million. She argued that if the wealthy paid their fair share, Social Security would be solvent for 75 years. She paused, then added quietly that such a solution would cost him money, implying his personal financial interest was the true barrier. His face reddened further as he defensively shouted that he paid millions in taxes. She clicked the remote again. A New York Times article appeared on the screen. The headline stark and undeniable: Trump paid $750 in federal income taxes in 2017. The room exploded into noise. A chaotic mix of supporters shouting allegations of fake news and others shouting back that the report was verified. The moderator tried desperately to restore order, but the revelation hung in the air like smoke. Crockett waited, possessing a patience that seemed to unsettle her opponent more than her words. When the noise finally subsided, she continued as if nothing had happened. She repeated the figure: $750. She noted that this was what he paid in federal income taxes the very year he tried to cut $72 billion from Social Security. She turned to face the audience, asking the room how much they had paid that year. An older man in the third row, wearing a John Deere cap, stood up. He introduced himself as a retired farmer and stated he had paid over $8,000 in federal taxes that year on his Social Security and a small pension. Crockett nodded, validating him. She pointed out that he had paid 11 times more than a self-proclaimed billionaire. She turned back to Trump, questioning his standing to lecture anyone about fiscal responsibility. Trump gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He stammered that his tax returns were under audit, claiming she did not understand the complexity of the tax code. She countered that she understood he paid less in taxes than a farmer. She understood that he had given himself and his wealthy friends a $1.9 trillion tax cut. She understood that 83% of that cut went to the top 1%. And she understood that after giving away nearly $2 trillion to billionaires, he had declared that the country could not afford Social Security. She clicked to a new slide, a simple calculation that displayed the math in stark terms. The cost of the Trump tax cuts stood at $1.9 trillion. While the Social Security shortfall was $2.02 trillion. She accused him of creating the crisis and then blaming the program for the deficit he engineered. Trump tried to pivot, a tactical retreat he often employed when cornered. He demanded credit for lowering prescription drug prices, claiming he had done more than any president in history and saved seniors thousands. Crockett was ready. A new slide appeared, a graph tracking prescription drug prices from 2017 to 2021. The line trended upward relentlessly. She noted that prices rose every single year of his presidency, with an average increase of 4.5% annually. For seniors on fixed incomes, she explained, that meant making the impossible choice between medication and food. She clicked again. A CNN interview appeared, featuring Trump speaking in 2016, promising to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. The clip ended, and Crockett looked at him. She reminded him that he had said it in 2016, 2017, and 2018, yet he never acted on it. She asked if he knew who finally passed Medicare drug price negotiation. And again, she provided the answer: Democrats. She cited the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, passed after he left office, which allowed Medicare to negotiate prices on the most expensive drugs, capped insulin at $35 a month, and capped out-of-pocket drug costs at $2,000 a year. These were all things he had promised but never delivered. Trump's face was flushing a deep crimson. He claimed they had tried, but the Democrats had blocked them. Crockett reminded him that he had enjoyed 2 years of Republican control of Congress, 2 years where he could have passed anything he desired, but he did not. Because pharmaceutical companies had donated $28 million to Republican campaigns during his presidency. She pulled out another document from the stack, citing his own budget from 2019. Page 78, she revealed his proposal to cut funding for the low-income subsidy program, the very initiative that helped poor seniors afford their medications. She stated that the cut would have eliminated assistance for 2.3 million seniors. A man in the back stood up. He was older, perhaps 80, thin and frail, wearing a veteran's cap. He announced that he was on that program and that it covered most of his heart medication. Without it, he explained, his voice cracking with emotion, he would pay $600 a month out of pocket. He revealed that he received only $1,200 a month in Social Security, and after rent and food, he had nothing left. Crockett nodded to him, asking for his name. He identified himself as James Patterson, a Vietnam veteran. She thanked him for his service and turned back to Trump, accusing him of planning to cut this man's medication assistance to fund tax cuts for billionaires. Trump stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He shouted that she was twisting everything, proclaiming his love for veterans and boasting that he gave them the biggest VA budget increase in history. Crockett's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. She asked if they should talk about the VA budget. She did not wait for his permission. She cited his 2020 budget, which proposed cutting VA healthcare by $4.5 billion. She detailed the stricter eligibility requirements that would have kicked 250,000 veterans off VA healthcare, veterans exactly like James. James remained standing, looking at the former president, asking simply if it was true that he had tried to cut his healthcare. Trump pointed at him, dismissing the claim as lies and fake news, insisting the VA got record funding. Crockett cut him off, clarifying the timeline. He had proposed the cuts, and Congress had said no. He then took credit for the funding that Congress forced him to keep. She pulled up another document, a digital copy on the screen with Trump's signature clearly visible at the bottom. She identified it as his own budget request, his signature, and his proposal to cut VA healthcare. The room fell into a heavy silence. Even Trump's most ardent supporters looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between the screen and the veteran standing in the back. James sat down slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. Crockett pressed on, signaling that she was not done, not even close. She announced that it was time to talk about Social Security disability insurance, the program that supported those who could not work due to physical or mental limitations. She stated that his 2020 budget proposed the most aggressive cuts to SSDI in modern history. A new chart appeared on the screen, outlining the devastation. She listed the $84 billion he proposed cutting from disability benefits over 10 years. She itemized the plan: stricter eligibility requirements disqualifying 500,000 recipients, mandatory reevaluations every 6 months designed to remove people from the rolls, eliminating benefits for anyone who could work any job, regardless of whether that job existed in their area or paid a living wage, and cutting benefits for anyone with more than $2,000 in assets, effectively punishing saving. She looked directly at Trump. asking if he knew who depended on SSDI. She clicked the remote. Photos appeared on the screen. A montage of American struggle, coal miners with black lung disease, construction workers with destroyed backs, veterans with PTSD, cancer survivors unable to work full-time, people with chronic pain and severe mental illness. She clicked again, revealing a news headline about the Trump administration proposing to make it harder to qualify for disability benefits. She asserted that these were not people gaming the system. The average benefit was a mere $1,358 a month. Barely enough to survive, yet he had wanted to cut even that. Trump tried to interrupt, claiming they were stopping fraud. Crockett countered that fraud accounted for less than 1% of disability claims. She refused to look at him, addressing the room as she declared that he wasn't stopping fraud, he was punishing people for being disabled. The tension in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on every person present. Crockett stood amidst her binders, the architect of a dismantling that was only just beginning. The first layer of defense had been stripped away, revealing the raw data beneath. And now, with the foundation of numbers laid, she was prepared to bring the human cost into the light. The silence that followed her last statement was not empty. It was filled with the collective realization that the confrontation had shifted from political theater to a forensic examination of betrayal. The heavy atmosphere in the room shifted as a woman in the audience slowly rose to her feet. She was younger than the majority of the seniors filling the rows. Perhaps 50 years of age. Yet her movement was labored and stiff. She leaned heavily on a cane, her knuckles white against the handle, steadying herself against a body that seemed at war with its own impulses. She did not wait for the microphone to reach her before she began to speak. Her voice trembling not with fear, but with the sheer physical effort of standing. She identified herself as a former nurse, a woman who had spent 25 years walking the halls of hospitals, caring for the sick, lifting patients, and working 12-hour shifts until her body could no longer sustain the demand. She explained that she suffered from multiple sclerosis, a cruel disease where her immune system attacked her nervous system. She detailed the reality of her life. Days where she could barely walk, where standing was an agony, and where the career she had built was stolen by her own biology. She directed her gaze toward the former president, her expression a mix of pain and confusion. She recounted how she had paid into the system for a quarter of a century, viewing every deduction from her paycheck not as a tax, but as an insurance policy for a future she hoped she would never need. Now that she needed it, now that she had been forced onto disability, she felt the stinging betrayal of his proposals. She admitted to the room that she had voted for him twice, believing his assurances that he would protect the safety net she now relied upon. She fell silent, her breathing audible, a living testament to the fragility of the human body and the necessity of the support systems being debated. Trump opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, seemingly at a loss for the first time since the confrontation began. The abstraction of budget cuts and fiscal responsibility had suddenly coalesced into a woman trembling on a cane in the middle of the aisle. Crockett did not let the silence stretch into awkwardness, she utilized it. She identified the woman as Betty Harrison from West Virginia, noting that Trump had won Betty's county by 39 points. She emphasized that Betty was not a political opponent or a planted agitator, she was one of his own voters, a member of the demographic he claimed to champion. Crockett turned back to the screen, signaling that the cruelty was not merely theoretical. She explained that his administration had not just proposed cuts but had implemented rule changes that actively harmed people like Betty. In 2019, she noted, the administration had altered the protocols for disability evaluations, making the qualification process significantly more arduous. She presented the data. In the first year alone, denial rates had spiked by 8%. That statistic represented 45,000 human beings. 45,000 people denied the benefits they would have received under the previous rules. Trump finally found his footing, interjecting that his administration was merely ensuring that only the truly disabled received benefits, framing the issue as one of integrity. Crockett shot back immediately, her voice sharp. She pointed to Betty, whose immune system was destroying her nerves, and asked if she was disabled enough for his standards. She pointed to the veteran, James, still seated in the back with shrapnel in his spine, and asked if he was disabled enough. She invoked the image of coal miners gasping for air with black lung and veterans waking up screaming from PTSD. She asked who got to decide the definition of truly disabled, implying that it should not be a wealthy man making decisions from a golf course in Florida. Her voice rose slightly, carrying the emotional weight of the room, as she condemned the disconnect between the policymakers and the people who had played by the rules, worked hard, and now faced destitution because of bureaucratic cruelty. Sweat began to sheen on Trump's forehead. The dynamic of the room had undeniably turned. The rows of supporters, previously buoyed by his confidence, were now quiet, their faces reflecting a dawning and uncomfortable realization. Trump, sensing the shift, attempted to pivot the conversation to his strongest ground, the economy. He began to speak rapidly about the tax cuts he had signed, describing the economy under his watch as the greatest in history, asserting that everyone had benefited from the prosperity he unleashed. Crockett was relentless. She seized on the mention of tax cuts as if he had stepped into a trap she had set hours ago. She declared that this was where the true deception lay. A new slide materialized on the screen behind her, a stark breakdown of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The numbers were devastating in their simplicity. The total cost of the legislation stood at $1.9 trillion. She highlighted the distribution of benefits. The top 1% of earners saw an average annual benefit of $51,000. In stark contrast, the bottom 20% of earners received an average benefit of $60 a year. She let the comparison hang in the air before delivering the specific statistic for the audience in the room. A senior citizen relying on Social Security received an average benefit from his tax cut of $50 a year. She repeated the figure slowly, $50. That was the sum total of the greatest economy ever, for the people sitting in the folding chairs before him. But the critique went deeper. She explained that the tax cuts were not paid for, they were financed by debt, adding nearly $2 trillion to the national deficit. She then played a montage of video clips, a damning sequence of cause and effect. First, Mitch McConnell appeared, stating gravely that the country would have to address entitlement reform. Next, Paul Ryan argued that Social Security and Medicare were the drivers of the debt. Then, Marco Rubio insisted that tough choices had to be made regarding entitlements. Crockett stopped the video and connected the dots for the audience. She accused the administration of giving away $2 trillion to the wealthy and immediately using the resulting deficit as a justification to cut Social Security and Medicare. It was a manufactured crisis, she argued, designed to transfer wealth upward while stripping the safety net from below. She pulled up another chart to visualize the disparity. She asked the audience to consider a senior living on $30,000 a year from Social Security, who received $50 from the tax cut. Meanwhile, a millionaire earning $1 million a year received $69,000. She calculated the ratio aloud, 1,380 to 1. She looked out at the sea of faces, driving home the reality that he had given a millionaire over 1,000 times more than he had given a senior citizen. And then had the audacity to claim the country could not afford to pay their benefits. Trump's face darkened to a deep red. He sputtered that the tax cuts helped everyone, that a rising tide lifted all boats. Crockett dismantled this trickle-down defense with cold efficiency. She pointed out that corporations saw their tax rate slashed from 35% to 21%. They had promised to use that windfall to raise wages and create jobs. Instead, she revealed, they spent $1 trillion on stock buybacks, inflating the value of their own shares to benefit executives and shareholders. Dividends flowed to investors, and CEO pay skyrocketed, while the average worker's wage increase barely kept pace with inflation, clocking in at less than 2%. She then made it personal. A photograph of Trump Tower appeared on the screen, a towering monument of glass and gold. She stated that he personally benefited from those tax cuts by millions of dollars through his real estate empire and business holdings. He had saved millions for himself and his circle. And in the same breath, proposed cutting Social Security for the people in that room. She leaned forward, her voice lowering into a tone of severe judgment. She accused him of taking from seniors who had paid into the system their entire lives to give to himself and his wealthy friends. She labeled it not as tax reform, but as theft. The murmur in the room grew louder, an angry undercurrent that vibrated through the floorboards. Trump stood up, his chair screeching, declaring that he would not sit there and be accused of crimes. Crockett's voice turned to ice as she ordered him to sit down. She reminded him that he had started this interaction by belittling her, questioning her intelligence, and insulting her dignity. Now, she asserted, he was going to sit there and face the facts. For a tense moment, they locked eyes, the flushed, furious face of the former president against the unyielding, steely gaze of the Congresswoman. Slowly, reluctantly, Trump sat back down. Crockett was not finished with the tax code. She revealed the final sting of the 2017 legislation, the expiration dates. She explained that the tax cuts for individuals, for the workers and families, were set to expire in 2025. However, the cuts for corporations were permanent. The bill was engineered so that working people would see their taxes rise, while corporations would keep their lower rate forever. She shook her head, questioning his audacity in calling himself a champion of the working class while orchestrating a policy that prioritized corporate permanence over individual relief. Straightening the papers on her desk, Crockett allowed the silence to reset the room. The atmosphere was no longer charged with political debate, it was heavy with the weight of receipts. She announced that she wanted to introduce the audience to 4 people. She described them as 4 Americans from red districts, Trump districts, people who had believed his promises and were now living in the wreckage of his policies. She nodded toward the back of the room, and a side door opened. "First," she said, her voice softening with respect, "I'd like you to meet James Patterson." The elderly veteran who had spoken briefly earlier walked slowly toward the front of the room. His movement was a study in endurance. Every step seemed calculated to minimize the friction in his spine. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had not known a pain-free day in decades. He reached the microphone and stood there for a moment, turning his veteran's cap over in his hands, his knuckles gnarly and weathered. He introduced himself formally to the room. James Patterson, 72 years old. He detailed his service in Vietnam from 1969 to 1971, mentioning his Purple Heart with a quiet modesty that made the accolade feel even more significant. He paused, gathering himself, before describing the legacy of that war, shrapnel embedded in his spine that surgeons could never fully remove. He spoke of living with chronic pain for 53 years, a constant companion that had defined his adult life. Despite this, he had returned home and worked in a factory for 40 years. He described 4 decades of waking up early, enduring the pain, going to work, and paying his taxes. He emphasized that he had paid into Social Security with every paycheck, holding up his end of the social contract. He turned his gaze directly to Trump. James stated clearly that he had voted for him. Twice, he recalled how Trump had stood at rallies and professed his love for veterans, promising to take care of them and swearing never to cut their benefits. James's voice cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through his stoic exterior. He revealed his financial reality: $1,847 a month. That was the sum total of his VA disability and his Social Security combined. He broke down the math of his survival. After rent, utilities, and food, he was left with approximately $200 each month for everything else: clothes, transportation, and, crucially, medication. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He identified it as Trump's 2020 budget proposal, the very document Crockett had cited earlier. He reminded the room that this budget had proposed cutting VA healthcare by $4.5 billion and instituting stricter eligibility for disability benefits. James looked up, tears welling in his eyes, and explained what those cuts would have meant for him personally. He would have lost about $340 a month. The room was deadly silent as he explained the significance of that sum. That money was not disposable income, it was his medication money. It paid for the pills that managed the pain in his spine, the medication for his heart, and the regulation of his blood pressure. Without that $340, he admitted he did not know how he would have survived. Trump attempted to speak, stammering James's name, but the veteran cut him off. James's voice grew firm, fueled by the righteous anger of the betrayed. He pointed out that Trump wore a veteran's cap and used veterans as props at rallies, claiming he would never let them down. But the document in James's hand said differently. The budget proved that Trump was willing to cut his benefits. It proved he was willing to make it harder for veterans to get disability. It proved he was willing to slash the health care of men who had bled for the country. James stepped closer to the table, the distance between the factory worker and the billionaire shrinking. He declared that he had taken a bullet for this country. He lived with metal in his spine. He had worked for 40 years despite the agony. And yet, Trump had been willing to cut his meager benefits to fund tax cuts for billionaires. James's voice broke as he confessed to feeling like a fool. He had believed the promises. He had defended Trump to his friends. And the whole time, the administration was planning to cut the lifeline he depended on. He turned to the audience, asking how many of them were veterans. Several hands rose in the silent room. He asked how many had voted for Trump because of the promise to take care of them. Most of the hands remained in the air. James delivered the verdict. He lied to us. He lied to all of us. Shoulders shaking, James walked back to his seat. The silence he left behind was profound. A vacuum where political rhetoric usually existed. Crockett let the moment hold, respecting the gravity of the testimony. She thanked James and then looked at Trump, asking if he had anything to say to the man he had proposed bankrupting. Trump's mouth opened and closed. He fell back on the defense of difficult budget choices, claiming they always supported veterans in spirit. Crockett did not let him hide behind generalities. She asked him flatly, yes or no. Did his 2020 budget propose cutting James's benefits by $340 a month? She demanded a binary answer to a complex betrayal. Trump's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the hostile room. He admitted that the proposal was a yes, but tried to qualify it by saying it was never meant to be implemented in that way. Crockett cut him off before he could spin the narrative further. She thanked him for the admission. The yes hung in the air, a confirmation that the document was not a fabrication, and the threat to James's life had been real. She turned back to the side door. The dismantling was not over, it was only the beginning. She announced that it was time to meet their next guest. A woman in her late 60s walked toward the microphone, small and thin, wearing a simple dress that seemed to hang loosely on her frame. Her hands trembled as she gripped the podium, grounding herself against the scrutiny of the cameras and the crowd. The room waited. The atmosphere had shifted from a debate to a tribunal, where the evidence was not just paper, but the living, breathing casualties of policy. The abstraction of economics had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, painful reality of promises broken and trust exploited. Trump sat in his chair, no longer the conductor of the event, but a defendant in the court of public opinion, forced to listen as the people he claimed to represent prepared to speak their truth. The room's attention centered on the small woman standing at the podium, her presence commanding a silence that felt almost reverent. She introduced herself as Betty Harrison, 68 years old, a resident of McDowell County, West Virginia. Her voice was soft, lacking the projection of a politician, but in the hush of the conference room, it carried with crystal clarity. She spoke of her husband, Tom, a man who had dedicated 35 years of his life to the coal mines. She described a life spent in the dark, descending into the earth at 18, breathing in the dust day after day, year after year. With trembling hands, she reached into her purse and retrieved a photograph, holding it up for the room to see. It showed a man in mining gear, his face smeared with the grime of his labor, yet smiling broadly, a testament to a pride in hard work that defined a generation. She told them that he had died 3 years ago from black lung disease. She described the horror of his lungs slowly turning to stone, his capacity to breathe diminishing until he spent his final 2 years tethered to an oxygen tank, barely able to cross the room without gasping for air. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked. As she detailed the financial precariousness of her widowhood, she explained that she depended entirely on his black lung benefits and his Social Security disability payments. Now, as a survivor, she received $1,200 a month. That sum was the totality of her existence, the financial wall standing between her and destitution. She turned her gaze to Trump, her expression hardening through the grief. She reminded him of his visit to West Virginia, recalling how he had donned a miner's helmet and punched the air, promising to bring coal back, promising to take care of the miners who had fueled the country. But she then held up a document, her hands shaking with a mixture of sorrow and rage. She identified it as his 2019 budget proposal. She explained that in that document, he had tried to cut the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund, the very solvent that paid benefits to dying miners like her Tom. Furthermore, he had attempted to eliminate automatic survivor benefits, the specific lifeline she was holding onto at that very moment. Betty pressed on, producing another document from the Department of Labor. She recounted how, in 2019, his administration had ceased enforcing protections against coal dust exposure. He had made it easier for companies to bypass safety regulations, prioritizing deregulation over human lungs. She connected the policy to the reality: more miners got sick. Her voice shook with a sudden, fierce anger as she accused him of protecting the coal companies rather than the people. Her husband had given his lungs for the industry, given his life for the power grid, and the president had tried to take away his death benefits to save corporations money. Trump attempted to interject, insisting that he had fought for coal miners, that he loved the industry. Betty did not yield. Her voice rose, overriding his protestations. She told him that he had rolled back safety regulations so companies could increase their profit margins. She accused him of trying to slash the Black Lung Fund so those same companies would not have to pay into it. And when the miners inevitably died, he had tried to cut the benefits for the widows left behind. She described the visceral reality of watching a loved one suffocate, the slow, agonizing failure of the lungs, the struggle for every single breath. She whispered the final condemnation: that was her Tom's life for 2 years. And Trump had wanted to take the meager compensation his death provided. She looked out at the audience, speaking to her neighbors, her peers. She noted that her county had voted for him in huge numbers because they believed he cared. They believed the hard hat and the thumbs up. But he had not protected them. He had protected the entities that killed her husband. Betty walked back to her seat, her body racked with sobs. Another woman in the audience wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. The room remained silent, save for the sound of her weeping. Crockett waited, allowing the emotional weight of the testimony to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. She then turned to Trump, summarizing the cruelty with surgical precision. She repeated the facts. Betty's husband worked for 35 years, died of black lung, and the president proposed cutting the fund for victims and survivors. She asked if he understood the implications, that Betty would have lost a third of her income, perhaps her home, forced to choose between food and medicine. She reiterated that a man gave his ability to breathe for his country, and the administration's response was to target his widow's survival money. Without waiting for a rebuttal that could not possibly suffice, Crockett introduced the third guest. A man in his early 70s approached the microphone. He was weathered and lean, dressed in clean jeans and a button-up shirt. But his physicality betrayed a life of hard labor. His hands were calloused, his face etched with lines from decades under the sun. He introduced himself as Tom Willis, a third-generation farmer, or, he corrected himself with a bitter inflection, he was a farmer until he lost everything. His voice was matter-of-fact, carrying the deep, resonant pain of a man who has lost his identity. He described the history of his land. His grandfather had purchased the farm in 1899. His father had worked it, and he had taken over in 1975. For over a century, the Willis family had cultivated 180 acres of Iowa farmland, growing soybeans and corn. He paused, staring at the floor for a moment before looking at Trump. He pinpointed the year 2018, the start of the trade war with China. He recounted the tariffs placed on Chinese goods and the inevitable retaliation that targeted American agriculture. The price of soybeans collapsed, plummeting from $10 a bushel to $7.50. He pulled out a calculator, treating the audience to the brutal math of his ruin. He grew 8,000 bushels a year. The price drop resulted in $20,000 of lost income in a single year. He had loans to service, equipment to maintain, seeds to buy. The math simply did not work. His voice remained steady, but his grip on the podium tightened. He stated that in 2019, the bank foreclosed, 120 years of family legacy evaporated. He looked directly at the former president, recalling the campaign speeches where Trump promised to fight for farmers, where he claimed the tariffs would help them win. Instead, Tom asserted, they were destroyed. He cited the statistic that farm bankruptcies had surged by 40% during the Trump presidency. Trump started to speak, blaming China for ripping off the United States, attempting to frame the trade war as a necessary geopolitical struggle. Tom's voice rose, cutting him off. He countered that the administration had ripped off the American farmer. He accused Trump of starting a war the farmers could not endure. China stopped buying, and the farmers paid the price. He produced another document, a receipt of the government's response. He acknowledged the $28 billion in emergency farm aid the administration had touted. He then asked the room to guess how much he had received. $180. He repeated the figure with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. $180 to offset the loss of a century-old business. He explained that the vast majority of that aid, over half, went to the top 1% of farms. The massive corporate agribusinesses, he, the family farmer, lost everything, while the corporate giants received millions. Tom took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the second half of his tragedy. After losing the farm, he had no income and no choice but to take Social Security early at the age of 62. He had wanted to wait until the full retirement age of 67. But survival demanded otherwise. He looked at Crockett, explaining the permanent penalty of that decision. By taking it early, his benefits were permanently reduced by 30%. Instead of $800 a month, he received $560. That reduction was a life sentence imposed by the trade war. He turned back to Trump, bringing the narrative to the present danger. He referenced Project 2025 and the proposal to raise the retirement age to 69. He told the room that if that rule had been in effect when he lost his farm, he would have had to wait 7 more years with no income. He would have starved. He shook his head, his voice cracking. He accused Trump of a triple betrayal, destroying the farm with tariffs, forcing a permanent reduction in Social Security benefits through economic desperation, and now proposing to move the goalposts even further away for the next generation. Tom looked out at the audience, asking how many farmers were in the room, how many had lost money, how many had taken emergency loans. Hands went up, a silent testament to the agrarian crisis. He concluded that Trump had promised to make agriculture great again but had nearly destroyed the family farm in favor of corporate friends. Tom walked back to his seat, his gait heavy. Crockett let the silence stretch, ensuring the connection between policy and poverty was unbreakable. She addressed Trump, reciting the chain reaction. Farm bankruptcies up 40%. A 120-year-old farm lost. A forced early retirement leading to permanently reduced benefits. She asked if he understood the cascade of harm his policies had triggered. Trump's face was red, his defense repetitive. He insisted the tariffs were necessary, that China was taking advantage. Crockett's voice was cold as she corrected the record. China did not lose the farm, Tom did. The strategy might have been geopolitical, but the casualty was domestic. She then motioned for the final witness. The atmosphere in the room was now thick with an undeniable tension. The abstract arguments of cable news, tariffs, deficits, entitlement reform, had been replaced by the visceral reality of black lung, foreclosure notices, and the terrifying math of survival. A woman in her mid-60s, Hispanic, walked to the microphone with a quiet, steely dignity. She wore slacks and a simple blouse. Her gray hair pulled back neatly, her posture upright despite the heaviness of the moment. She introduced herself as Maria Santos, 66 years old. Her English was precise, her accent slight but present. She told the room she had worked at an auto parts factory in Michigan for 45 years. She had started on the line at 21. For nearly half a century, she had clocked in, done the work, and paid her taxes. She reached into a folder and pulled out a yellowed, fragile piece of paper, a pay stub from 1979. She pointed to the deduction line, Social Security tax, $14.73. She emphasized that she had paid that tax from every single paycheck for 45 years. She turned her eyes to Trump. She recounted the events of 2020. When her plant closed, the company filed for bankruptcy. And the pension fund, which she had counted on for her old age, was revealed to be severely underfunded. She was supposed to receive $4,800 a month. After the bankruptcy, her payout was slashed to $720. 60% of her future had evaporated. 45 years of labor. And the promise was broken. She held up another document. A report from the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. She explained that this agency was supposed to be the backstop, the protection for workers when companies failed. Yet, during Trump's presidency, the agency became underfunded by $48 billion. She looked directly at him, accusing his administration of making it easier for companies to underfund pensions. Rolling back the protections that stood between workers and corporate rating, she stated with controlled anger that she was not a CEO or a wealthy investor. She was the one making the parts. And when the company failed, they took her pension to pay their debts. Maria pulled out the final piece of paper. She explained that she now depended almost entirely on Social Security. She received $1,100 a month, combined with her reduced pension. Her total income was $1,820. That was the sum total of 45 years of contribution to the American economy. She leaned forward, her voice intensifying. She reminded Trump that he had wanted to cut Social Security every year. She cited Project 2025's proposal to cut benefits for anyone making over $40,000 a year, a threshold that would impact people with small pensions like hers. She demanded to know how he could justify cutting the benefits she had paid for. Trump tried to speak, muttering about saving the system. Maria's eyes blazed. She cut him off, asserting that these were not handouts. They were not entitlements in the sense of charity. They were her money, money she had worked for, money she had paid in. She turned to the audience, asking how many of them had worked 40 or 50 years. How many had seen that deduction on every paycheck? Nearly every hand in the room went up. She told them that it was their money, and he wanted to take it. She turned back to Trump, delivering a final, crushing indictment. She listed his broken promises. He said he would bring manufacturing back. Yet her plant closed. He said he would protect pensions. Yet hers was cut by 60%. He said he would never touch Social Security. Yet he tried to cut it every year. Her voice dropped, becoming deadly serious. She spoke of coming to the country at 15, learning the language, working hard, paying taxes, doing everything America asked of her. She shook her head, declaring that he did not get to take away what she had earned. Not from her, and not from anyone who had worked as hard as she did. Maria walked back to her seat, her head held high. The room was absolutely silent. Even the most loyal supporters looked shaken. The narrative of the forgotten man, having been reclaimed by the very people Trump claimed to represent. Crockett stood again, surveying the room. She spoke quietly, bringing the four narratives together into a single, cohesive indictment. 4 Americans, all from Trump districts, all lifelong workers, all believers in his promises. She looked at each of them in turn. James, the veteran with shrapnel in his spine. Betty, the widow of the coal miner. Tom, the farmer who lost his legacy. Maria, the factory worker stripped of her pension. She turned to Trump, her voice rising with the momentum of the evidence. She told him that these were his voters. They believed him, and every single one of them would have been devastated by his policies. The moderator, who had been silent for a long stretch, finally cleared his throat. He asked Mr. Trump if he would like to respond to the testimonies. Trump stood, his movements jerky, his face flushed. The casual confidence he had displayed at the beginning of the event was entirely gone. Replaced by a defensive aggression, he began to speak loudly, dismissing the stories as sad, but pivoting immediately to the macro argument that they had to understand the budget. Crockett cut him off. She stated that they understood perfectly. They understood he promised to protect the programs. They understood he tried to cut them. They understood he gave tax cuts to billionaires and then claimed the country was broke. Trump jabbed a finger at her, shouting that she was twisting everything, that the budget proposals were complex. Crockett's voice turned to ice. She demanded a simple answer. She asked if he proposed cuts. Yes or no. Trump tried to dodge, claiming it wasn't that simple. She pressed him again. Yes or no. Did he propose cutting Social Security, Medicare, and disability benefits? The room held its breath. Trump's face was purple. He finally admitted, quietly, that the proposals were, yes, but attempted to qualify that they were reforms. The word, yes, hung in the air like a gunshot. Crockett thanked him, declaring that they were finally getting somewhere. She walked around the table, closing the physical distance between them. She reminded him of his exact words on the campaign trail. "I will protect and save your Social Security and Medicare." She clicked the remote, playing the video of him making that promise to thunderous applause. She told him that the whole time, he was planning to cut them. Trump tried to blame the deficit. Crockett retorted that he started the deficit with his tax cuts. She reminded him that he gave away $1.9 trillion, mostly to the wealthy, and then used the resulting debt as an excuse to cut programs for working people. She flashed the chart again, the cost of the tax cuts versus the benefits. She reiterated the ratio. Millionaires received 1,380 times more than seniors. She shook her head, labeling it not as fiscal responsibility, nor conservatism, but as cruelty. Trump tried to rally, shouting that this was ridiculous, that he would not stand there and be lectured. He stammered, looking for an insult, but Crockett stepped closer. She challenged him to finish the sentence. Lectured by whom? Someone younger? Someone black? Someone who was a woman? She let the implications land. She reminded him that he had started the interaction by calling her sweetie, by questioning her intelligence. Her voice dropped, becoming dangerous. She told him she understood perfectly. She understood he was a con man. She understood he told people what they wanted to hear while planning to do the opposite. She understood he preyed on trust and then betrayed it. Trump's hands were shaking. He sputtered that she couldn't speak to him that way. Crockett turned to address the full room. She declared that she just did. And now, she added, everyone in the room understood it too. She gestured to the 4 witnesses. She told the audience that these 4 people represented millions of Americans, veterans, widows, farmers, workers, people who built the country, people who paid in, people who believed. She accused Trump of looking them in the eye and promising protection, then going to Washington to cut their benefits to fund his friends. She pulled up a final slide, a photo of Mar-a-Lago. She noted its value at $300 million. She explained that he benefited from tax loopholes that allowed him to pay almost nothing. He collected no Social Security because he didn't need it, he had generational wealth. She turned to the audience. She told them that for many of them, Social Security was it. It was 70, 80, sometimes 100% of their income. And he wanted to cut it. A man in the audience stood up. He was older, wearing a Trump 2020 hat. He asked a question, his voice trembling. He looked at Trump and asked if he really proposed those cuts. He explained that he had voted for Trump because of the promise to protect Social Security. He asked, simply, "Did you lie to us?" Trump opened his mouth, closed it, and tried to explain that the situation was complicated. The man demanded a yes or no. Trump admitted the proposals existed but claimed they weren't meant to happen. The man took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He told Trump that he had defended him to his children, to his friends. He realized now that he was wrong. He dropped the hat on his chair and walked toward the exit. His wife followed. Others began to stir. An elderly woman stood, crying, reminding Trump that he had come to her church and held up a Bible. She accused him of being the one trying to cut their benefits all along. She sat down, sobbing. Trump looked around the room. The hostility was palpable. The confusion and betrayal on the faces of his supporters were undeniable. He tried one last pivot, bringing up illegal immigration. Crockett cracked the whip immediately. She told him to stay on topic. She demanded he answer for his broken promises. She stated that the border had nothing to do with the fact that he proposed cutting Social Security every year he was in office. Trump shouted about crime, trying to run from the subject. Crockett stepped directly in front of him. She told him to stop deflecting. Stop changing the subject. Face what he did. Trump's face was twisted with rage. He shouted that she didn't talk to him like that, asking if she knew who he was. Crockett's voice was deadly calm. She told him she knew exactly who he was. He was a con man who made promises to vulnerable people and betrayed them. He was someone who took from the poor to give to the rich. She pointed at the witnesses. She accused him of looking at a veteran with shrapnel in his spine and deciding his benefits were negotiable. She accused him of looking at a widow and putting her survivor benefits on the table. She accused him of looking at a bankrupt farmer and feeling nothing. She accused him of deciding a factory worker didn't deserve what she earned. Her voice rose to a crescendo. She told him that was who he was. And now, everyone in the room knew it. Trump stood there, breathing hard. For a moment, it seemed he might flee. But Crockett wasn't done. She reminded him that the moderator had asked for a commitment earlier. She demanded a clear answer now. She looked into his eyes and asked, "Will you commit right now to protecting Social Security and Medicare? No cuts, no privatization, no raising the retirement age. Yes or no?" The room held its breath. Trump's mouth worked. He muttered that they had to be smart, that they couldn't just keep spending. Crockett translated. That wasn't a yes. He said everything had to be on the table. Crockett translated. So that's a no. The room erupted. Shouts came from all sides. Supporters demanded clarification. Others shouted that they knew it. The moderator tried to restore order. But chaos reigned. In the middle of the noise, James, the veteran, stood up. His voice cut through the din. He announced that he had something to say. The room quieted. He repeated his service record. He stated that he had voted Republican his whole life. He had voted for Trump twice. He paused, then declared he would not be voting for him again. He turned and walked out. Betty stood next. She said she was glad her husband wasn't there to see what Trump really was. She followed James. Tom stood. He said Trump destroyed his farm and he was done. He left. Maria stood last. She said 45 years of work was not something he got to take. She walked out with her head high. One by one, others began to stand. Trump merchandise was removed. Heads shook. Tears fell. The room had shifted. The spell was broken. Trump shouted that it was a rigged event. An ambush. That the people were plants. Crockett's voice cut through his tirade. She told him to stop. She walked to the center of the stage. She declared that this wasn't an ambush, it was accountability. She had brought his budgets, his words, his proposals. She had brought real people. Nothing was fake. She gestured to the screen. The proposals to cut Social Security, Medicare, and disability were facts. The tax cuts for the wealthy were facts. Her voice was tired but firm. She stated that the only question was whether people believed his promises or his actions. She looked at the camera. She listed the betrayals: James, Betty, Tom, Maria. She asked how many more people had to be hurt before the electorate stopped believing the promises and started looking at the actions. Trump was backing toward the exit. He shouted that he didn't have to listen to a kangaroo court. Crockett stopped him with her voice. She accused him of leaving because he couldn't face the people he made promises to. She accused him of running from facts and real stories. Trump's hand was on the door. Betty's voice came from the back. She had stopped in the doorway. She told him he couldn't even face them. Her husband died believing in him. And he was running away. Trump looked at her. For a split second, something flickered in his expression. Then it hardened. He told her he didn't have to justify himself to you people. The room went cold. Maria's voice was sharp. She reminded him they were American citizens. Veterans, workers, taxpayers. You people, Trump repeated, his voice rising. He accused them of coming with sob stories and fake documents. Crockett's voice was ice. She told him they weren't fake. And now everyone knew it. Trump pushed through the door and left. The room sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, an older man began to clap. Just one person at first. Then another. Then more. Not everyone joined in. Some sat furious, arms crossed. But others clapped, some crying, some looking relieved, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Crockett stood at the podium, watching the reaction. She spoke quietly into the microphone. She noted that he wasn't coming back. When confronted with facts, he ran. When asked to face the people, he left. She gathered her documents. She told them they deserved better. They deserved leaders who kept promises and faced hard questions. She looked at the four witnesses standing together at the back. She thanked James, Betty, Tom, and Maria for their courage. She looked at the camera. She stated that this wasn't about Republican versus Democrat. It was about promises kept versus promises broken. It was about protecting benefits versus giving tax cuts to the wealthy. She closed her binder. She told the audience they had seen the budgets and heard the stories. They had watched him refuse to commit. They had watched him run. She picked up her papers. She told them they had a choice to make. Then, she walked off the stage. The confrontation did not end when the doors of the conference room swung shut, rather. That was merely the moment it escaped the confines of physical space and ignited the digital sphere. The video footage, originally a continuous 2-hour stream, was immediately cannibalized by the internet, chopped into digestible, weaponized fragments that spread with the velocity of a contagion. The full unedited recording remained available for the purists and the historians. But for the scrolling masses, the narrative was consumed in moments of high-definition conflict. The first clip to go viral, accumulating millions of views within hours, was the opening salvo. It captured the precise instant of condescension, the frame tight on Trump's face as he uttered the diminutive, "sweetie," followed by the panning shot to Crockett's unblinking, steely reaction. It was a masterclass in visual storytelling, the arrogance of power meeting the immovability of preparation. The sound of the first binder hitting the table became an audio meme. A rhythmic thud that punctuated remixes and news broadcasts alike. It was the sound of bureaucratic weight crashing down on rhetorical fluff. Then came the receipts. The hashtag receipts Crockett began to trend globally. Then hashtag read the budget. And finally, the heartbreaking hashtag my receipts, where ordinary citizens began posting their own stories of financial betrayal. The visual of Crockett stacking the binders 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 became an iconic image of the political cycle, a symbol of evidence triumphing over bluster. Political cartoonists drew her as a builder constructing a wall of facts, while Trump stood on the other side, armed only with a megaphone. But it was the witnesses who provided the emotional ballast that kept the story from fading into the usual partisan noise. The clip of James Patterson, the Vietnam veteran, holding his cap and describing the shrapnel in his spine, struck a chord that transcended political affiliation. His tearful admission that he had felt like a fool for believing the promises was shared across veterans' forums, turning up on screens in VFW halls and American Legion posts. The juxtaposition of his service with the proposed budget cuts to his healthcare created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of spin could easily smooth over. Betty Harrison's testimony resonated in the hollowed-out industrial towns of the Rust Belt. The image of her trembling hand holding the photo of her husband, the coal dust smeared on his smiling face, became a banner for the betrayal of the working class. Her raw grief, captured in 4K resolution, made the abstract concept of black lung benefit cuts horrifyingly real. It was no longer a line item in a spreadsheet. It was a widow weeping for a husband who had suffocated. Tom Willis and Maria Santos rounded out the quartet of viral testimony. Tom's breakdown of the soybean tariffs, the calculator math that ended a 120-year family legacy, dismantled the myth of the trade war's success. Maria's pay stub, yellowed with age, became a symbol of the broken contract between the American worker and the economy. The internet sleuths, usually prone to conspiracy, turned their attention to verification. Within 24 hours, the budget documents Crockett had cited were located on government archives, highlighted, and circulated. The page numbers she had referenced, page 64, page 112, page 45, were accurate to the letter. The fake news defense was crumbling under the weight of public PDFs. Trump's reaction was predictable, swift, and remote. From the safety of his own social media platform, he launched a barrage of posts characterizing the event as a setup, a trap, and a disgrace. He attacked the moderator for losing control. He attacked Crockett, recycling the insults about her intelligence and experience, calling her nasty and disrespectful. He claimed the witnesses were paid actors, crisis actors brought in by the radical left to smear him. He insisted that the binders contained blank paper, that the video was edited, that the audio was manipulated. He demanded apologies. He declared himself the victim of an ambush, a kangaroo court designed to make him look bad. However, the strategy of denial faced a unique hurdle. The receipts were real. Major news networks, sensing the shift in the wind, began to run segments not just on the drama, but on the substance. CNN produced a breakdown of the specific budget pages Crockett had cited, verifying the proposed cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Fox News, usually a safe harbor, found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why a Republican president had proposed cutting veteran benefits while claiming to expand them. Pundits debated the body language of the walkout, the image of a former president retreating from a room of seniors, turning his back on a veteran and a widow, played on a loop. It was a visual of weakness that pierced the armor of the strongman persona. Crockett, for her part, did not immediately take a victory lap. She understood that the power of the moment lay in its solemnity, not in celebration. When a reporter finally caught up with her a week later, asking if she believed the confrontation had changed any minds, she answered with careful deliberation. She suggested that the event had reminded people to prioritize actions over words, to check promises against reality, and to demand evidence. She credited the bravery of the four witnesses, shifting the spotlight back to James, Betty, Tom, and Maria. When pressed on Trump's accusation of an ambush, she dismantled the premise with the same logic she had used in the conference room. She asked how bringing his own published budgets and his own recorded words could constitute an ambush. She questioned the logic that suggested voters should not know what was in the documents their leaders signed. She addressed the accusation of disrespect regarding the "conman" label by reframing the interaction. She pointed out that he had brought insults and deflection, while she had brought facts and real people. She defined the term rigorously. A conman makes promises he does not intend to keep, gains trust, and then betrays it, by listing his specific betrayals, promising to protect Social Security while proposing cuts, promising to help veterans while slashing VA budgets. She argued that the label was not an insult, but a descriptive categorization of his behavior. The fallout for the witnesses was intense. Their names and faces were now public property. Trump's most fervent followers targeted them online, digging for dirt, accusing them of being plants. But the verification process held firm. James was a documented Purple Heart recipient. Betty's husband's death certificate listed black lung. Tom's foreclosure was a matter of public record. Maria's pension fund collapse was a known industrial tragedy. The attacks only served to highlight their authenticity. 3 months after the event, the impact had not dissipated, it had metabolized into a quiet but persistent movement. James Patterson gave an interview to a prominent veterans news site. When asked if he regretted speaking up, he shook his head. He expressed regret only for believing the lies for so long. He utilized the platform to articulate a new mission, urging veterans to look at the record, not the rhetoric. He touched the pin on his lapel, the symbol of his sacrifice, and stated firmly that he had almost let someone cut his benefits because he listened to speeches instead of checking the actions. His message was simple: check the receipts. Betty Harrison returned to McDowell County, the heart of coal country, a place that had voted overwhelmingly for the man she had confronted. It was not an easy return. She faced cold shoulders at the grocery store and angry whispers at church. But she also found quiet support. A neighbor, a woman who had also lost a husband to the mines, approached her and asked if she regretted it. Betty's answer was absolute. She stated that her husband had given his lungs for coal, and the man she confronted had tried to steal the benefits that kept her alive. She did not regret telling the truth about that. Not for a second. Her stance emboldened others in the community to whisper their own doubts, to look at their own shrinking checks and wonder if they had been duped. Tom Willis never recovered his farm. The land that had been in his family since 1899 was gone forever, sold off to a conglomerate. But he found a new purpose in the wreckage. He began traveling to town halls and farmers' markets, carrying his foreclosure notice like a shield. He spoke not with the polish of a politician, but with the grit of a survivor. He told audiences that anger was not enough. They needed to understand the mechanics of the policy that destroyed them. He connected the abstract trade wars to the specific auction block where his tractor was sold. He became a living warning, a ghost of the agrarian dream, telling anyone who would listen that the promise of making agriculture great had ended in bankruptcy. Maria Santos went back to her small apartment in Michigan, surviving on her $1,820 a month. But she channeled her energy into organizing. She volunteered with a workers' rights group, helping others understand the precariousness of their own pensions. She preached the gospel of ownership, that Social Security and pensions were not gifts from the government, but deferred wages earned through sweat and time. When asked why she fought, she cited the attempted theft of her livelihood. She declared that she would not let them do to anyone else what they had tried to do to her. In Washington, the atmosphere around Jasmine Crockett changed. She was no longer just a junior congresswoman. She was the woman who had made the former president walk out. Colleagues treated her with a new deference. The term, receipts, became shorthand in committee hearings. If a member made a claim, others would ask to see the binder. It forced a subtle but perceptible shift in the discourse. The lazy generalizations that usually dominated cable news segments were increasingly met with demands for page numbers and citations. Students of political science began to study the confrontation. Communication professors dissected the strategy, noting how Crockett never rose to the bait, never engaged in the shouting match, and never allowed the subject to be changed. They analyzed the use of the verify and pivot technique, acknowledging the insult, then pivoting immediately back to the data. The video became a primary source text on the power of evidence-based argumentation in an era of post-truth politics. The cultural ripple effect extended even to the merchandise. "I brought receipts" t-shirts appeared, not sold by a campaign, but created by independent artists. The image of the binder became a symbol of resistance, not violent resistance, but intellectual resistance. It represented the refusal to be gaslit, the refusal to accept a narrative that contradicted the documentation. Trump continued to campaign, of course. He continued to hold rallies, continued to promise the moon and stars, continued to claim he was the savior of the senior citizen and the worker. But the footage from the conference room followed him. Advocacy groups cut the clips into 30-second ads that played in swing states. They showed the split screen, Trump promising to protect Social Security on one side, and the highlighted text of his budget proposing cuts on the other. They showed James asking if he had been lied to, and Trump failing to answer. They showed the empty chair after the walkout. The polling data began to show a calcification of the shift Crockett had hinted at. It wasn't a landslide, political polarization was too entrenched for that. But among seniors in Florida, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, the margins tightened. Among veterans, a traditionally solid bloc, doubts crept in. The shy voter phenomenon began to work in reverse. People who publicly nodded along with the MAGA rhetoric but, in the privacy of the voting booth, remembered the budget cuts and the widow's tears. One night, late in her office, a staffer asked Crockett if the confrontation still bothered her, specifically the insults. Crockett looked at the stack of budget documents that still sat on her desk, the paper edges worn from use. She admitted that the misogyny always bothered her. Every time a man in power tried to diminish a woman with pet names or questions of intellect, it was a sting. But she looked up, her expression calm and resolved. She stated that receipts did not care about feelings. Receipts did not care about insults. Receipts were the great equalizer. The video remained online, a digital monument to the day the bluster ran into the brick wall of reality. Millions watched it, and millions learned the most dangerous question a voter could ask: show me the budget. As the election cycle ground forward, the specter of that conference room hung over every debate about the economy. When Trump tried to pivot to culture war issues, opponents would pivot back to the budget. When he claimed to be the builder of the greatest economy, they would hold up the chart showing the $50 benefit for seniors versus the $69,000 benefit for millionaires. The narrative had been breached. The armor was dented, and in the quiet living rooms of America, people like James, Betty, Tom, and Maria were no longer just statistics, they were the jury. And they were finally seeing the evidence. The political landscape had fractured into two distinct realities. On one side stood the fortress of the binder, a structure built from government PDFs, page numbers, and the stubborn persistence of recorded video. On the other side roared the chaotic machinery of denial, a vast engine of noise designed to grind facts into dust. As the election season turned toward the final, brutal stretch of autumn, The confrontation in the conference room ceased to be a mere news cycle event and metamorphosed into a haunting presence on the campaign trail. Trump returned to the rally stage, seeking the adulation that served as his oxygen. The venues were the same: airplane hangars, fairgrounds, cavernous arenas, and the playlists remained unchanged. A loop of classic rock and operatic arias. Yet, the energy had curdled. He moved through his standard set list of grievances, attacking the media, the border, and the radical left, but he found himself shadowed by the ghosts of the four witnesses. When he launched into his routine about protecting seniors, the cheers were punctuated by an uncomfortable hesitation. He could see it in the faces of the front row, a flicker of doubt that had not been there in 2016 or 2020. The image of Betty Harrison holding her husband's photo had burned itself into the collective retina of his demographic. He attempted to banish the specter with volume. He shouted that the budgets were fake, that the Congresswoman was a liar, that the witnesses were deep state operatives. But the visual language of his opposition had evolved. At a rally in Pennsylvania, a group of seniors in the back did not hold signs, they held up blank white binders. They stood silently, a mute chorus reminding the room of the documents he refused to acknowledge. Security removed them, but the image circulated on social media. A viral contagion he could not quarantine. The response from the campaign's inner circle was to unleash the digital hounds. If the facts could not be disputed, the people holding them had to be destroyed. The internet, a weapon Trump had wielded with mastery for years, was turned against James, Betty, Tom, and Maria with a ferocity that bordered on psychological warfare. James Patterson, the man with shrapnel in his spine, became the first target. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with fabricated records claiming his service was exaggerated, that his Purple Heart was purchased, that he was a registered Democrat who had never voted Republican in his life. The disinformation was crude, easily disproven by the military archives. But its purpose was not truth, its purpose was exhaustion. James woke up to death threats on his answering machine, voices twisting his patriotism into treason. He found his home address posted on forums dedicated to harassment. For a week, he sat in his living room with the curtains drawn, his service pistol on the table, watching the country he bled for try to erase him. But the strategy backfired. Instead of retreating, the veteran community rallied. The attack on a Purple Heart recipient, one who had presented verifiable proof of his injuries and his voting record, struck a nerve that transcended partisanship. Local VFW chapters, many of them conservative strongholds, issued statements of support. Men who had never voted for a Democrat in their lives drove to James's house. Not to harass him, but to sit on his porch and stand guard. The attempt to smear him simply illuminated the cruelty of the machine that sought to silence him. Betty Harrison faced a different kind of assault. The narrative spun against her was one of manipulation. Online pundits claimed she was a wealthy actress hired by the opposition, analyzing the fabric of her dress and the quality of her dental work to prove she was not a struggling widow. They mocked her tears as theatrical. But in McDowell County, the reality was stubborn. Her neighbors knew her. They knew Tom. They had seen the hearse. When a camera crew from a fringe right-wing network arrived in town to expose her, they were met by a wall of coal miners, men with black dust in their pores and Trump flags on their trucks, who told the crew to leave. The loyalty to the tribe was strong, but the loyalty to the shared suffering of the mines was stronger. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, took the show on the road. She understood that the viral moment was a spark, not a fire, to burn down the structure of lies. She had to tend the flame in the windiest places. She launched what the press dubbed the receipts tour, bypassing the friendly blue strongholds to book town halls in the heart of the Rust Belt. She traveled to union halls in Michigan, community centers in rural Wisconsin, and veterans posts in Arizona. She did not go to these places to scream or to lecture. She went to read. The format of these events was radically simple. There were no pyrotechnics, no walk-on music, no teleprompters. There was only a table, a stack of binders, and a microphone. She would invite the audience to ask about any topic: immigration, healthcare, infrastructure, taxes. When a question was asked, she would not give a stump speech. She would open the binder. She would find the page, cite the line number, and read the exact text of the proposal. She treated the budget not as a political document, but as a revelation of intent. In a high school gymnasium in Saginaw, Michigan, a man wearing a "Make America Great Again" hat stood up and challenged her. He shouted that Trump had brought back jobs and that the Democrats had shipped them away. He repeated the talking points he heard on cable news, his voice vibrating with genuine belief. Crockett did not mock him. She did not call him a fascist or a cultist. She thanked him for his passion. Then, she asked him if he worked in the automotive industry. He said he did. She opened the 2018 budget binder. She read the section detailing the administration's proposal to cut funding for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, a program designed to help small manufacturers compete with foreign competitors. She read the section on the tax incentives that rewarded companies for automating assembly lines, effectively replacing workers with robots. She projected the text on the screen behind her. She asked him to look at the words. She asked him to reconcile the promise of jobs with the policy of automation and outsourcing incentives written in black and white. The man stared at the screen. He argued that it was fake. She invited him to come to the stage and look at the government seal. To look up the document on his own phone right there. He did. The room watched as he scrolled, his thumb swiping against the glass, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. He found the page. He read the words. He did not take off his hat. And he did not renounce his candidate. But he sat down slowly, the wind taken out of his sails. It was a victory of inches. But wars of ideology were won by inches. As the weeks passed, the four witnesses found themselves drawn together by the gravity of their shared experience. They arranged to meet in Philadelphia, a central point for the final push of the campaign. It was a private gathering, away from the cameras, in a small diner off the interstate. James, Betty, Tom, and Maria sat in a booth, an unlikely coalition of the aggrieved. They ordered coffee and pie, the mundane comfort of diners serving as a counterweight to the madness of their public lives. They compared scars, not the physical ones, but the digital ones. James spoke of the threats. Betty spoke of the mockery. Tom showed them the hate mail he had received from fellow farmers who called him a traitor to the industry. Maria shared the messages telling her to go back to a country she left 50 years ago. But beneath the trauma, there was a steeling of resolve. Tom, the farmer who had lost everything, spoke for the group. He said that for the first time in his life, he felt clean. He had spent years swallowing the cognitive dissonance, ignoring the reality of his failing farm because he wanted to believe in the dream. Telling the truth, he said, cost him his anonymity, but it gave him back his dignity. Maria nodded, her hand resting over his. She said that they were no longer just victims, they were witnesses. And in a trial, the witness is the most dangerous person to the guilty. They decided, over lukewarm coffee, that they would not hide. They would escalate. The climax of this phase of the conflict came not in a debate hall, but in a televised town hall event hosted by a major network in Ohio. Trump had refused to debate his opponent again, citing bias. So the networks had pivoted to separate town halls. Trump's event was scheduled for prime time. The audience was screened, supposedly undecided voters, but the campaign had worked hard to pack the room with sympathetic faces. However, the network, under immense pressure to uphold journalistic standards after the viral explosion of the Crockett tapes, had insisted on a segment dedicated to the budget. They had invited a special guest to ask a question. The campaign had agreed, assuming they could steamroll whoever it was. Halfway through the broadcast, the moderator stopped the flow of softball questions. He announced that they had a question regarding entitlements. The camera panned to the audience. Standing there, dressed in his Sunday best, wearing his purple heartpin, was James Patterson. The air left the room. Trump, seated on a stool on the stage, stiffened. He recognized the man immediately. The campaign managers in the control room began shouting into headsets, demanding to know how this had happened. But it was too late. The signal was live. James did not shout. He did not make a speech. He held a single sheet of paper. He looked at the former president and spoke with the calm authority of a man who has nothing left to lose. He stated that since their last meeting, he had been called a traitor, a liar, and a thief by the campaign's supporters. He said he had been doxxed and threatened. He asked Trump simply if he condemned those attacks on a veteran. Trump tried to weave. He said he condemned all violence, but that there was a lot of passion on both sides, and that James had to understand that people were angry about the lies being told about the budget. James interrupted him. He did not ask permission, he simply overrode the president. He held up the paper. He said this was not a lie. This was a letter from the Social Security Administration, dated from the Trump presidency, informing him of a freeze in his cost of living adjustment due to a change in the calculation formula, a change Trump's administration had enacted. He said that letter cost him money. He asked Trump to look him in the eye and tell him that the letter was fake. Trump blinked. He looked at the camera, then at the audience, then at James. The pivot and attack reflex failed him because the target was too sympathetic, and the evidence was too physical. He muttered that they would look into it, that it was likely a bureaucratic error, a mistake by the deep state. James remained standing. He told Trump that it wasn't a mistake, it was a policy. And then, he did something that broke the format completely. He turned his back on the president. He looked directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall, and addressed the millions of veterans watching at home. He told them to check their mailboxes. He told them to check their statements from 2018 and 2019. He told them the evidence was in their own homes, not just on the news. The town hall ended in a chaotic murmur. The network cut to commercial. But the damage was done. James had weaponized the audience's own archives. In the days that followed, the "check your files" movement began. It was an analog revolution in a digital age. People began digging through old filing cabinets, shoeboxes of receipts, and dusty folders. They found the letters, the notices, the subtle adjustments to benefits that they had dismissed as confusing government jargon at the time. Now, viewed through the lens of the Crockett confrontation, these papers transformed into proof. Crockett watched from her office in Washington. The polls were shifting. It wasn't a tidal wave, the country was too divided for that. But the tectonic plates were grinding. The white working-class vote, the fortress of the Trump coalition, was showing hairline fractures. The data showed a 3-point swing in the Rust Belt, a 4-point swing among veterans. In a game of inches, this was a mile. She received a text message late one night from Maria Santos. It was a picture of a union hall in Detroit. The room was packed. In the front row, holding a binder, was a young woman, likely Maria's granddaughter. The caption read, "She is learning to read the receipts." Crockett set the phone down and looked out the window at the Capitol dome, glowing white against the dark sky. The narrative had escaped her control. And that was exactly what she had hoped for. It was no longer about her performance, or her binder, or her viral moment. It was about a contagious realization that governance was not a reality show, but a contract written in ink and numbers. The noise of the campaign was deafening, the ads, the rallies, the tweets, but underneath it all, a quieter sound was growing louder. It was the sound of pages turning in thousands of living rooms. The sound of a country finally doing its homework. But the beast was wounded, not dead. As the calendar turned to November, the Trump campaign, sensing the slippage, prepared its final, desperate gambit. If they could not win on the facts, and they could not destroy the witnesses, they would have to burn down the concept of truth itself. They began to tease a bombshell revelation, a counter-narrative that they promised would expose the entire receipts movement as a fraud. They booked a massive rally in Madison Square Garden for the final weekend, promising a revelation that would change everything. Crockett knew what was coming. It wouldn't be facts. It would be a spectacle designed to eclipse the facts. She called James, Betty, Tom, and Maria. She told them to be ready. The war of noise against silence was about to enter its final, violent crescendo. The receipts were on the table, but the table was about to be overturned. The spectacle at Madison Square Garden was designed to be the death knell of the truth. It was a sensory assault, a coliseum of red light and deafening sound engineered to overwhelm the cognitive faculties of the 20,000 souls packed into the arena and the millions watching via satellite. The campaign had promised a revelation that would shatter the receipts movement, and they delivered a production value that rivaled a Super Bowl halftime show. Amidst pyrotechnics and a thundering orchestral score, the former president took the stage, not as a politician, but as a victim of a grand digital conspiracy. The bombshell was introduced by a parade of pseudo-experts and cyber-forensic analysts who projected complex, nonsensical code onto the jumbotrons. The narrative they spun was audacious in its scope. The government archives themselves had been compromised. They claimed that the budget documents Crockett had cited, the PDFs hosted on federal servers, the physical copies in the Library of Congress, were forgeries implanted by a deep state cabal to retroactively smear the president's record. They argued that the real budgets, documents that supposedly promised infinite abundance and protection for seniors, had been deleted from history. It was the ultimate gaslight. Do not believe the documents in the library, believe the man on the stage. Trump seized the microphone. Basking in the roar of a crowd desperate for absolution, he told them that the letters they had found in their shoeboxes, the letters James Patterson had held up on national television, were fakes, mailed out by rogue bureaucrats to confuse patriots. He absolved the crowd of the need to read. He offered them the comfort of conspiracy. The applause was rapturous, a collective exhale from a base that had been uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance of the last few months and was eager to embrace a reality where their hero was flawless and the paperwork was the enemy. For 48 hours, the strategy seemed to work. The media ecosystem fractured. Partisan networks ran wall-to-wall coverage of the digital coup, casting doubt on the immutable nature of the written record. The polling numbers, which had been drifting away from Trump, stalled. The sheer volume of the lie created a gravity well that threatened to swallow the simple, quiet facts Jasmine Crockett had marshaled. The four witnesses, James, Betty, Tom, and Maria, felt the ground trembling beneath them. They watched as their lived experiences, their physical pain, and their financial ruin were dismissed as the byproducts of a grand algorithmic hallucination. But the campaign had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that the battle was purely digital, fought in the cloud where truth is malleable. They had forgotten that bureaucracy exists in the physical world. Crockett did not call a press conference to refute the conspiracy theories. She did not engage in a shouting match with the cyber experts. Instead, she orchestrated a final, silent offensive rooted in the tangible. She put out a call, not for tweets, but for paper. She asked every American who had received a physical letter from the Social Security Administration, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or the Department of Agriculture between 2017 and 2021 to bring those documents into the light. The response was an analog uprising. In town squares across the Rust Belt, in church basements in the South, and in community centers in the Midwest. People gathered with their filing cabinets. They brought the yellowed envelopes, the trifold letters with official watermarks, the denial notices stamped with government ink. This was not a digital archive that could be hacked. This was the physical sediment of governance. James Patterson led the gathering in Philadelphia. Hundreds of veterans stood in formation outside Independence Hall, not with weapons, but with their benefit adjustment letters held against their chests. The visual was striking. Rows of men and women, many bearing the scars of war, holding the undeniable paper trail of the cuts they had endured. There was no code to decipher, no server to blame. There was only the ink on the page, signed by the administration, mailed to their homes, and stored in their drawers. In West Virginia, Betty Harrison stood on the steps of the courthouse in McDowell County. She was joined by dozens of other widows, holding the black lung benefit denial letters that had arrived during the Trump years. The local news cameras captured the dates on the letters, the official seals, the stark language of rejection. It was a wall of evidence that no rally rhetoric could penetrate. Tom Willis returned to the site of his foreclosed farm in Iowa. He stood by the fence of the land he no longer owned, holding the auction receipt and the federal letter denying his request for adequate aid. Farmers from the surrounding counties joined him, parking their trucks along the highway, taping their own foreclosure notices and loan rejection letters to their windshields. It became a caravan of receipts, a silent protest of the dispossessed stretching for miles through the cornfields. Maria Santos walked into the headquarters of the union in Detroit, followed by a stream of auto workers. They laid their pension reduction notifications on a long table, creating a paper mosaic of broken promises. The sheer volume of the documents was overwhelming. It was a physical manifestation of the economic violence that had been inflicted upon them. A mountain of proof that could not be dismissed as a glitch. The media narrative broke. The juxtaposition of the flashing lights and cyber conspiracies of Madison Square Garden against the somber, gritty reality of veterans and widows holding physical paper was too stark to ignore. The fake news defense crumbled when the news was printed on government letterhead held by a grandmother in a small town. The receipts movement had transitioned from a hashtag to a historical record. Election day arrived under a blanket of gray clouds, the atmosphere heavy with the friction of a divided nation. The lines at the polling stations were long and unusually quiet. The boisterous shouting matches that had characterized previous elections were absent, replaced by a solemn determination. Voters stood in the drizzle, many clutching manila folders or envelopes, a talismanic reminder of why they were there. The demographic shift that Crockett had sensed began to materialize in the exit polls. It was not a landslide. The country was too entrenched in its tribal identities for a total realignment. But in the margins, in the critical percentages that decide the fate of the Electoral College, the gray wall cracked. Seniors in Florida and Arizona, who had voted Republican for decades, marked their ballots with the memory of the budget proposals in their minds. Veterans in Pennsylvania and Georgia, men who had listened to James Patterson, broke ranks. The rural counties did not flip blue. But the margins of victory for Trump shrank significantly as farmers like Tom Willis stayed home or cast a protest vote, refusing to endorse the man who had erased their legacy. As the night wore on, the map began to fill with colors. But the story was in the details. The networks zoomed in on the specific districts where the witnesses lived. In James's district in the suburbs of Philadelphia, the veteran vote swung 6 points away from Trump. In Betty's County in West Virginia, Trump still won, but his margin was the lowest it had been in 12 years, a testament to the widows who refused to be silent. In the industrial pockets of Michigan where Maria organized, the turnout among retired union workers hit record highs, fueled by the anger of the pension cuts. When the race was finally called, days later, it was the receipts coalition, the seniors, the veterans, the disabled, the rural poor, who had delivered the decisive blow. The margin of victory was razor thin, built on the backs of those who had finally looked at the ledger and realized the math did not favor them. The aftermath of the election brought a quiet settling of the dust. The rallies ceased. The pyrotechnics of Madison Square Garden were dismantled. The noise of the campaign faded, leaving behind the stark reality of the results. James Patterson returned to his quiet life, but the silence in his home was no longer oppressive. He received a letter from the new administration, a simple acknowledgement of his service and a promise to review the cost of living adjustments for disabled veterans. He framed it and hung it next to his Purple Heart. He continued to visit the VFW, where he was no longer a pariah but a quiet elder statesman. The man who had reminded his brothers in arms that loyalty to the country meant demanding the truth from its leaders. Betty Harrison remained in McDowell County. The coal mines were not coming back, and the struggle for survival remained acute. But she had found a new voice. She organized a local advocacy group for widows, teaching them how to navigate the bureaucracy, how to file appeals, and crucially, how to read the fine print of every promise made to them. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a librarian of the community's rights, guarding the facts against future encroachments. Tom Willis never farmed again. The land was lost, and time moves only in one direction. But he found a measure of peace in the classroom. He began volunteering at the local agricultural college, teaching a seminar on agricultural policy and economics. He taught the next generation of farmers not just how to grow crops, but how to read trade agreements, how to understand subsidies, and how to protect themselves from the machinery of politics. He carried his foreclosure notice in his briefcase, not as a badge of shame, but as a lesson plan. Maria Santos retired from her organizing role, her body finally demanding the rest she had earned. She spent her days with her grandchildren, watching them grow in a world she hoped would be slightly less predatory. On her bookshelf, between the family albums and the religious icons, sat a binder, a copy of the budget documents she had helped expose. It was a family heirloom now, a testament to the time Grandma fought the president and won. Jasmine Crockett returned to the halls of Congress. Her stature forever altered. The moniker, Receipts Crockett, had stuck. But she wore it with a solemn gravity. She was no longer just a partisan warrior, she was the keeper of the record. In committee hearings, when the rhetoric began to fly and the cameras began to roll, she would simply reach for the heavy binder on her desk. The sound of her hand resting on the cover was often enough to bring the room to order. One evening, months after the inauguration, Crockett found herself alone in the National Statuary Hall. The marble figures of history stood in the shadows, silent witnesses to the centuries of debate. She thought about the noise of the last year, the insults, the viral clips, the screaming crowds, the digital lies. It had all seemed so overwhelming, so unstoppable. And yet, it had been stopped, not by a louder shout, but by the whisper of pages turning. She realized then that the binder was not just a collection of numbers. It was a mirror. It forced the country to look at its own reflection, to see the gap between who it claimed to be and what it actually did. The four witnesses, James, Betty, Tom, Maria, had held that mirror up, despite the pain it caused them, and in doing so, they had broken the spell of the con. Crockett walked back to her office, the click of her heels echoing on the stone floor. On her desk, the binder waited. The work was not done. New budgets would be written. New promises would be made. New attempts to hide the truth in the footnotes would be drafted. But the precedent had been set. The people now knew where to look. They knew that the truth was not in the speech, but in the spreadsheet. They knew to ask for the receipts. The story of the confrontation became a modern parable of American politics, taught in civics classes and cited in history books. It was the story of how a billionaire was defeated by a veteran with a bad back, a widow with a cane, a farmer with a calculator, and a factory worker with a pay stub. It was the story of the heavy, unglamorous, undeniable weight of the truth. And it served as a permanent warning to those who would seek to govern by illusion. The ink is dry. The paper is real, and the people are reading.